Hello, I'm Anawultus, and today I want to give a bit of advice, or more exactly, an observation on the dangers that we might be suffering from the reaction to the recent outbreak of SARS coronavirus 2. So, with the SARS coronavirus 2, which is now all over the world, a few thousand people have died and seems to continue spreading. We haven't hit the peak yet, as is believed. Governments are, of course, reacting, and they are affording themselves special emergency powers in order to deal with the crisis, and in some cases, to minimize the risk or minimize the loss of life. Now, of course, there is always a danger because a crisis is usually the easiest place for you to lose your freedoms and your liberties, or for someone to attempt to monopolize more power in the government. A crisis is usually that time. And I think there's many of examples throughout history. I would say that the reaction to the 9/11 attacks, uh, primarily on the Pentagon, but also on the World Trade Center, led to an increase of surveillance in the US government, and also a new push to go out and fight more wars. And all of that is ongoing. Or Abraham Lincoln's emergency decrees during the American Civil War. Many of them changed the way that the government functioned in a more permanent way, or things resulting from the Great Depression. So a crisis generally can have long-lasting consequences, and it's always very important to observe whether, when a crisis occurs, whether the status quo is restored or whether the government chooses to keep more power that it has originally granted itself for the emergency, but chooses to expand the power. So, toward this, I have 5 important elements that I think are very important, 5 important ideas that the government, or any government really, at least any government that is non-authoritarian or totalitarian government, should really implement in how it deals with how these emergency powers are allocated. So the first point is that if you're going to allocate certain emergency powers, you need to define what the emergency is. Define what the crisis is. You need to put forward the exact reason why this is all happening. And there are some implications from that. The second point is you need to define the exact type of emergency powers that the leader is acquiring. The third point is that you need to put forward a sunset, or a time limit for the emergency powers before the emergency powers automatically stop or need to be reinstated. And the fourth point that I think is important is you need to create a way for the regular government to stop the emergency powers and to perhaps control whatever is happening there. And the fifth point is that if any of the first 4 points are violated, the punishment for whichever leader is violating these 4 points must be very severe. They must be punished, and they must be punished severely. So back onto the first point, the idea of defining the crisis. So it's very simple. You need to define what the emergency is, and then if whatever the emergency was has ceased to be, then obviously the emergency powers also need to cease to be. It's very simple, and it's a way to prevent a perpetual emergency, or to prevent these things from being expanded beyond their original purpose. So it creates a specific purpose for the emergency powers. The second point on the exact powers, and you might say, well, if we want to solve the problem, shouldn't we solve it, especially if it's an existential crisis for the country, shouldn't we need to solve it by any means necessary so that the country doesn't collapse? Well, I say that sure, you can say that you would want any means, but I think it's better to be very specific on what means you're going to use. Because, for two reasons. One reason is that if you have those means defined, then you don't end up in a situation where, let's say, the leader has emergency powers, and then if the powers aren't clearly defined, then the leader essentially can do whatever he wants. And that's generally not the idea of emergency powers, to give a leader the ability to do anything he wants, even if it has nothing directly to do with the emergency. So the leader, when he declares the emergency, he needs to be very specific on what exactly he is going to do. And that leads into the second point, because the second idea here is that it shows that the leader has a plan to solve the emergency. And I'm not saying that if something else shows up, that's it. You can always grant additional emergency powers as the situation needs it, but those also need to be defined. In other words, it's to define what exactly it is. And also it means that when the emergency ends, you know exactly which powers to rescind from among the emergency powers. At the same time, it also means that the leader that is dealing with the emergency has a specific limit on what he can do, which means that if he exceeds that limit, then you know that maybe the leader is acting in bad faith. So the third point, the time limit, I mentioned earlier, it's very straightforward. If you put a time limit on emergency powers, that means that once that time is up, you need to re-examine the situation and decide whether or not to extend the emergency powers. Now, ideally, I would say that ideally you would maybe have a constitutional proviso that says that a leader can only grant to himself emergency powers for a maximum period of time before the regular government can then choose to either extend those or to cease those. And what do I mean by that? Well, the idea of an emergency is that something has happened. It's emergent and it's urgent. And so you need to respond to it quickly, and the regular legal process to do that might be too slow. But if you're, let's say, 6 months down the line, then can you really say that it's still something that the government can't catch up with? Which leads to the fourth point, that the regular government, needs to be able to integrate whatever happens back into their functions, and to reintegrate itself and to reassert its power away from the emergency leaders. And this prevents a situation where the leader can declare a perpetual emergency and and then people are waiting for the emergency to end, and therefore for the regular government to resume its functions. But what this also does is, if, let's say, something happened as an emergency, but now it's becoming an ongoing problem, it helps reintegrate an ongoing problem into the regular government process, as it should be. So if something starts out as an emergency but then becomes an ongoing problem, then I think it should fall back into the regular business as usual government, because at that point it's really earned its place there for being an ongoing problem. And of course, the final point, harsh punishment for any leader, even if it's the top leader in your country. I think that person needs to be harshly punished if he breaks any of the four previous points by either extending the powers beyond the crisis, extending the powers beyond what has been defined for him to do, expanding the powers beyond the time limit that has been allotted, or stopping the regular government from resuming its functions. I see all four of these as being as essentially constituting an existential crisis for that government, and therefore, by providing an existential crisis to the government, by completely disrupting its function, and by taking over, essentially accumulating power that is undue in the legal system, that is a very severe crime. To the degree that I would recommend a death penalty for doing this, because if you become an existential threat to the country, it makes sense that the country should then become an existential threat to you. But I understand that some people are hesitant about using the death penalty, or even using it against maybe the top leader of your country. That might be a bit of extreme for some people, and I understand that. But it all depends on your philosophy of leadership, I suppose, because on the one hand, you might have an idea of cultivating particular leaders to be strong, and ultimately that leads to a culture wherein leaders can be considered irreplaceable. I, on the other hand, have a viewpoint of establishing a system that encourages certain types of leaders to the degree that leaders are relatively replaceable, so that no person is indispensable, and that means that the death of any one person should not be what destroys the country. No one person should be that important, especially in a large country. But anyway, getting back on point, the reason why I suggest all these things, the reason why I want to bring this to attention, is because in a crisis, that is the point where those who are power hungry can gain power. And even those who are not necessarily power hungry but have good intentions might accumulate power for the sake of an emergency, but will keep it. And I've already mentioned, in the United States, the US government has a very long track record of doing this. And I think it's manifest throughout most of the major crises in U.S. history, but it also happens in other countries. In fact, I would say that this happens almost universally and is just a general feature of politics. But I just wanted to make everyone aware of this and aware of my thoughts on this. And I'm not saying that Donald Trump has authoritarian ambitions. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. I don't think he does. But what I'm saying is that the government as a whole and politicians as a whole generally have a tendency to keep power that has been given to them. So I think it's very important to emphasize that after a crisis, things should return to the status quo, or perhaps even remove more emergency powers that the government has given itself over a longer period of time to regain the freedom that has been slowly eroded over the centuries. But of course, some people might agree, some people might disagree. Tell me in your comments what you think. And if you'd like to discuss this with me or discuss other issues, feel free to contact me as well. Thank you all for watching, and I'll be seeing you all next time on Wiltus over and out.